All right, we're going to try this again. This is the third time I'm trying to make this video. Maybe it's a sign I shouldn't make the video, but it is what it is. A user on YouTube, Abber Dabber, asked me to elaborate on something I said in another video about how the Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox communities in America are patriotic Americans that don't have dual loyalties, and he uh, made it an issue about about immigration, and basically saying that the fact that Jews can get dual citizenship to Israel is unfair, particularly when Jews, in general, liberal Jews, are pushing to go are pushing more liberal immigration standards, and how this can lead to anti-Semitism, and what is the Hasidic approach to this? Meaning that when how things are going bad in Europe because of liberal immigration views, so the Jews can just escape to Israel, and will that happen in America as well? There's truth in this, and there are things that is theory that I don't really know about. It's possible. And the first thing I want to explain is that the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic approach to anti-Zionism is different than political approaches to anti-Zionism, because it's religiously motivated, and motivated particularly by the Jewish religion. And so it's different, therefore, than, let's say, the anti-Zionism of an Arab Palestinian who has a different approach, or different reasoning for their anti-Zionist views. So, for example, the Satmar community, which is the largest Hasidic community in the world, certainly in America, it's more like a few different communities, and then there are smaller communities that align with Satmar in this ideology. Their approach to anti-Zionism is not based on political ideas, but rather religious ideas. Mostly, they can be summed up as follows: that if we go and make a Jewish state before the Messiah comes, the Talmud says that it will increase anti-Semitism. And then the Satmar argument would be as follows: that the Zionist movement, having begun in the 1890s, has led to an increase in anti-Semitism, and in many ways is even responsible for the Holocaust. And so the basic view of the Satmar community is anti-Zionist, to say that we should wait patiently for the Messiah to come, when the whole world will be at peace, and not try to force God's hand by going and taking over the Holy Land and building a state, and perhaps even building a temple and all these things. There's a lot of common sense and practicality in that. First of all, we see in Israel there's been so many wars and things. Even if you want to dismiss the idea that there was a connection between Zionism and the Holocaust, and that those 6 million Jews were killed with some responsibility of the Zionists on their hands, which we can discuss the merits and demerits of that argument, but plainly and simply, after the war, if Jews would have gone to America or somewhere else and just been part of this society, and not gone and specifically made a Jewish state, it would have lessened their amount of being a target, because they're not specifically making a Jewish state. And by making a Jewish state, they created themselves as a target for whoever would oppose such a thing outside of our community. And so that's why many rabbis said that they didn't want to be part of a Jewish state, including rabbis who lived in the Holy Land, who lived in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, when it was under British rule or even under Ottoman rule, that they wanted to be independent of the modern state of Israel. And they also, an argument you often hear, particularly Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro brings many, many times vis-a-vis Zionism, is that Judaism is a religion and not a race and not a nationality. And whatever Benjamin Netanyahu does should have no impact on me as a Jew living in Queens, as Rabbi Shapiro does, or in Sullivan County as I do, or a Jew in Melbourne, Australia, or in London or in France. And that it's a chutzpah, it's an unmitigated gall for Israel to claim to be somehow representing the Jewish people as a whole, for people who have no connection to the state of Israel. And furthermore, it's, on the other hand, although it's none of our business what the state of Israel does, but it doesn't really make sense for it to be a quote-unquote Jewish state, but rather it would seem to make more sense, be more practical, if it was just a plain secular state that had no religious attachment to it. And so that's the ultra-Orthodox view, one of many ultra-Orthodox views on Zionism. You always say you have two Jews, you have three opinions. So even among groups that are anti-Zionist and non-Zionist, you are going to find that there are different approaches to this. It's not to say that Jews cannot live in the Holy Land, but even many, actually, it's quite the opposite of what this story with Abber Dabber is saying. I know Jews who are American citizens who live in the Holy Land, and they went out of their way to ensure that their children should only be American citizens and not have dual citizenship. And they, I remember I was sitting at it was on Hoshana Rabbah, and I was in a home of a rabbi who is from one of the more pro-Israel Hasidic communities. Oh, let's say it like that. He's certainly not an anti-Zionist, and could even go so far as to say he's on the fringe between non-Zionism and religious Zionism. This is a community. The Slonim Hasidic community in Israel. There are two. There's one in Jerusalem and one in Bnei Brak, and they follow different rebbes. So the one in Jerusalem has a certain amount of pro-Israel sentiment. His Hasidim tend to speak Ivrit instead of Yiddish. Even in the yeshiva, everything is in Hebrew instead of Yiddish. And it's considered to be a more modern Hasidic group, quote unquote. Because of that, they are not as extreme. They're pretty middle of the road, and as far as Zionism, even they might even take some stances that are even a little bit pro-Zionist, even extremist religious Zionists to a certain extent, perhaps. But certainly they're supportive of the state of Israel. They receive money from the state of Israel. This particular rabbi, who is a devotee of this particular community, he had a guest in his home who was from the extreme Neturei Karta, which is much different in their ideology than the Satmar community that I just described. This particular individual, he grew up in a modern Orthodox community, and he became a Neturei Karta, and he often, would protest together with Palestinians. His ideology even comes to a certain extent to be political more than religious to a certain extent, although he has religious arguments as to his views. And they're sitting together with radically different views, but as brothers, as friends, as fellow Jews. This Neturei Karta man is not Hasidic. He is very proud that he follows the Vilna Gaon's approach, although still, all in all, he still has a certain devotion to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov and goes to Uman most years for Rosh Hashanah, this particular Neturei Karta gentleman. And the rabbi from the Slonim community, a Slonimer Chassid, I think his name's Spiegel, he said like this, he said, he said he, as being part of a community that takes money from the Israeli government, he is more anti-Zionist than the Neturei Karta who refuse to take money from the Israeli government, because Kematzal B'Yadam, he's taking money away from the Israeli government. He's taking money away from secular pursuits, and then that was one argument he had. Of course, the argument is that, well, you're spiritually supporting the state by giving them the merit of supporting Torah. That's a typical anti-Zionist argument vis-a-vis this issue. And then this rabbi said, and my children all have, even though they were born in Israel, they all have a certificate that says that they are not Israeli citizens. Ki hu lo ezrach b'Yisrael. He's not an Israeli citizen. My kids are 100% American citizens, even though they reside in Jerusalem. And that being said, it's most likely that he's saying that because, why would he get such a thing? It's because he wants to avoid them having any issues of having to be drafted into the Israeli army, which even many rabbis in the Israeli army admit is a spiritual death sentence. It means that you're going to be ripped away from your faith. It's very hard to stay religious, even in a religious squadron in the IDF. And I've heard this from rabbis who are chaplains in the IDF. But you see it, but you can make the same argument, working in secular environments, that you're going to wind up compromising on certain things that you wouldn't if you were, sitting in yeshiva. But we'll put that aside. And so he said, this rabbi said, Chaim Tzvi, you think you're such a big anti-Zionist because you have a Palestinian passport, but do you have a letter that says that you're not an Israeli citizen? That's even a bigger badge, I think this rabbi is being a little bit facetious, to be honest, maybe a little bit intellectually dishonest, although I have respect for him. But the point, what I'm saying here, why am I bringing this? What does this have to do with the question? The answer is as follows, is that the approach of the Hasidic community being anti-Zionist is a religious issue and not a political one. It's based on scripture, and that includes, so what does that have to do with being a patriotic American? The answer I have is as follows. It says in the book of Jeremiah, in the Bible, you should pray for the peace of the city which I've sent you, because in their peace is your peace. So the idiom is often your welfare depends on their welfare. And I don't mean government handouts welfare, I mean their well-being. That if whatever country we live in is successful and at peace, it's going to be good for us as well. And we should and Jeremiah is telling someone who's coming from a totally into a totally foreign culture that you should, to a certain point and certain extent, identify with that culture, because their success, your success is linked with their success, and their success is linked with your success. Their well-being and your well-being are one because we're part of a community. And even though we might have our own cultures and our own religions that are different, to a certain extent we also are part of the shared culture. And it's true. And I think, just to answer some of the sentiments that are being echoed here, I don't know how true the sentiment is. First of all, how many Jews, because there are many Jews who are not religious and really don't give a damn about Israel. In many ways, the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists love the Holy Land and love the people of the Holy Land more than your average secular Jew who has no connection to Israel. A Satmar Chassid is going to feel a certain camaraderie and a certain identity shared, although different but similar, to wherever he lives in the world, to Jews in Mea She'arim, who are also anti-Zionist. He's going to feel an obligation to support the anti-Zionist community in Israel, in Mea She'arim particularly, or in Beit Shemesh, if he's a successful businessman working in a diamond district in Manhattan, he's going to feel an obligation to be supportive of Rabbi Hasidim, in Jerusalem, who are, sitting and learning all day and not taking government handouts, and who maybe some of them have their own businesses, but most of them are relying on the kindness, not of the Israeli government, but of Hasidic Jews in America and England and Belgium, who are supporting them financially, or at least aiding them financially, because they refuse to take money from the Israeli government. Now that's not an identity with the state of Israel, it's an identity with and a camaraderie of brotherhood with Jews who live in Israel who don't identify with Israel, and having that shared ideology, they're going to feel a certain brotherhood, even though their religion is identical, their culture is quite different. There's a very different culture in Mea She'arim than there is in Williamsburg, with many similarities, but quite a few marked differences, which maybe someone on the outside wouldn't understand the sociology behind that, but there's even Satmar Hasidim in Jerusalem and in Bnei Brak. Maybe to a certain extent you'll find, business people who live in Bnei Brak, Satmar Hasidim, who are more similar to Satmar Hasidim in Williamsburg, But there are similarities and differences in the culture, and there's a certain appreciation of that as well. But all of these things that I mentioned, the being a patriotic American and not having dual loyalties to Israel, are religious and not political. Meaning it's not a political devotion to America, but rather religious devotion to America. Understanding just the same how Jeremiah told the Jews in Babylonia how they should feel about Babylonia and not be expecting to go back to Israel tomorrow, to Eretz Israel. What they wouldn't, Israel is something else, but they weren't expecting to go back to Judea, to Jerusalem, and as much as they wanted to, Jeremiah was like, no, you got to stay here for 70 years and wait. And it's a practical, normal approach to life. Because if you're sitting around expecting the Messiah is going to come tomorrow, it's not so healthy. Rather, we should wait for the Messiah to come. Maimonides doesn't say, or at least what we say in our Animamins, it doesn't say that I am expecting the Messiah to come every day, but rather that I'm waiting for the Messiah to come every day. There's a big difference between the two ideas. Maybe some people are going to be upset at me by that. There's a hope. But there's also a recognition that I'm going to wait every day, and I'm not going to give up hope for world peace, for everything to be good, for all people to all worship the one God and live in peace. I can hope and look forward to that, but I also have to be practical to wait for that. And not to live my life like, I've got to go, move to Israel because the Messiah is going to come tomorrow. And then people are sitting and waiting and waiting. I mean, that was the whole Shabtai Tzvi debacle. Was that all these people, they got up and they just left all their stuff behind and went to Jerusalem, and then they're like, well, this guy's not the Messiah, and now they were in trouble. And they went, and it made them lose faith. Rav Shach, who was from the non-Zionist camp and the non-Hasidic camp, he said to tell people who were settling in certain disputed territories around Israel, he said, don't lose your faith when they make you leave. He said, because you'll remember there was an old Jew in Bnei Brak who told you that these settlements are going to be destroyed and they're not going to last, and he was right. Excuse me. Now, back to this question of Jews who don't have anything to do with Israel. I would venture to say that most of the Jews who are not religious and who are liberal about immigration are not really thinking that they're going to pick up and move to Israel when things go bad. I know that there's reason for conspiracy theories that, and there might be people like George Soros who do have an ideology like that, although George Soros is totally hated in Israel. And George Soros, but I can see George Soros, perhaps, playing around with immigration to create havoc because he's just an evil person and he might have some way to make money off of that, some evil scheme. He's like a villain from a James Bond movie, like petting the cat, like Dr. Evil in Austin Powers. That's who George Soros really is, so I could picture someone like him, but the average liberal Jew, I think they're brainwashed. They don't even see George Soros for who he is. And to a certain extent, their motivation could be, we're all a nation of immigrants, and they don't see all the bad stuff that's happening in Europe and so forth. And the thing is, for the most part, America is a much bigger country than any of the European countries. So America as a whole is not going to be fundamentally transformed by Muslim immigration. Because first of all, the Muslims who come to America tend to be moderate. The vast majority of American Muslims are moderate, politically what I mean? They're not seeking to impose theocracy. I don't like this term when people talk about Sharia law. It makes me uncomfortable. The quote unquote fight against Sharia. Personally, I have a somewhat of a liberal stance in that, but it's not in the idea as much as it's in the parlance, the terminology being used, the semantics. Because Sharia for a Muslim is like halacha is for a Jew, for a pious Jew, and like how the word of wisdom is for a Mormon, and like how the canon law is for the Catholics, and for many other Christians have their own canonical law. Episcopalians, so forth, have their canon law, and Amish have their rules that they live by, and Baptists have their rules that they live by. And so Sharia, and so people say, but look, there are Sharia courts. Well, there are Jewish Batei Din as well, where people might litigate civil cases, not have to bother the government-run courts for a civil matter, to have arbitration privately without the government, without having to get the government involved. And also, these are two people from the same faith who are agreeing on certain things, and so they would listen to a rabbinical court. And if that's how the Sharia courts operate, I don't have a problem with that. However, if rabbinical courts are doing something illegal, so too I have a problem with Sharia courts doing something illegal. There's an accusation that I personally don't believe to be true, but and I believe probably the Israeli government is somehow involved because of their anti-religious stance. There's an accusation that a rabbi was going to murder someone or hire a hitman or something in order to help a woman because the man refused to give a divorce. And there are occasionally cases where there are violent people who will attack a man who refuses to give a divorce. And that's illegal. And I certainly do not condone murder, and Jewish law does not condone murder. There are passages in Jewish law, and you're not allowed to murder someone who refuses to divorce his wife, and you're not allowed to hire someone else to murder someone who refuses to divorce his wife, and that's why I don't believe this is a true case, and I think they're taking certain terms that people said out of context in order to arrest someone, and I don't think it's true that that there's any even thought of attempted murder here with this case. But if it were true, I believe that such a rabbi should be punished to the fullest extent of the law in the American court system. As far as beatings, there are passages in Jewish tradition that say that you can force a man, even perhaps violently, to divorce his wife. That's talking about cases where he's required to divorce the wife, not in cases where he refuses, and even though there is a certain requirement, but not in the cases that we have today. So it's so anyone who does that, I feel it's a misinterpretation of Jewish law. But at least there they have they do have texts that can back them up, quote unquote. I disagree with their interpretation of the text. But even so, even though they have the text, they can't hide behind religious freedom to assault someone. And if they are arrested in the assault, it's their own fault, question is someone getting away with it, this and that. That might be different. Do you have to report someone? I don't know. But certainly, once they get caught, they got what they deserved, and I think they kind of know that they're taking their freedom into their own hands when they engage in this type of activity. That they might be arrested for it. Now, maybe they might feel there's a certain level of martyrdom, that here they're helping this woman to be free, and they're willing to take that risk in order to, in an altruistic way, to help someone else. And maybe if there's some money involved, it's not as necessarily altruistic, but it might encourage them to take the risk. That's, of course, immoral, and it's wrong, but, I can believe those stories more, but this particular story, as far as and I think, there is a certain understanding of martyrdom, perhaps, that they're trying to help someone who is in need, and they're willing to maybe even sit in prison in order to help someone else, and that that could be a righteous thing to do. And maybe when they're asking for the money, it's to pay someone else to do it and not for themselves. I don't know. Those type of questions are questions that have to be addressed. But then again, there are consequences when you engage in this type of behavior. And so too, if someone, and you cannot hide behind religious freedom to engage in this type of behavior, and there are consequences. I mean, people do violate laws regularly. People speed, or they might go through a red light, or roll through a stop sign, or might not wear their seatbelt and things like that. It's like Bishop Fulton Sheen said, nobody, after speeding, when they get home, they don't, bend over their steering wheel and say an act of contrition. But maybe they should. I don't know, because the question is, is it right in society? And there can be arguments on both sides. But personally, I feel that it's wrong to engage in illegal behaviors when, depending on, and if someone gets caught, it doesn't mean that necessarily I would report them unless they're going to harm someone else. But these are the type, but I believe it's wrong. But, there can be different arguments back and forth as far as that is, but there is rule of law, but this is how people conduct themselves, and sometimes there is a justification to protest an improper law and an unjust law and so forth, and there is that idea as well. And sometimes it's the right thing to do. Rosa Parks on the bus, she was doing the right thing, breaking the law. But you can't have anarchy. You have to have law. You have to have a rule of law. But part of the rule of law is that sometimes people do things that are illegal, and sometimes judges have their prerogative to decide, what exactly happened and how to judge a case. I mean, there was a story of a rabbi some years ago who spent 2 years in federal prison for money laundering. When he did not pocket the money, he gave it to the poor, and he was helping starving widows and orphans by engaging in money laundering. And the judge himself said, he recognizes what he did, but he also recognizes wrong, and the rabbi also recognizes wrong. But to a certain extent, it might have been. But so he gave him 2 years in prison because he had to. But he wouldn't, but he could have given more. But he recognized, and perhaps for the rabbi himself, those 2 years in prison were a form of martyrdom to help someone in need, because and the real villain in that story was not the rabbi, but the guy who cheated on his taxes, who actually benefited from the money laundering, and not the rabbi himself, who had no personal benefit from the crime that he committed, but he perhaps had a spiritual benefit from it. That he saved a widow and orphan, who needed the help. And these are the type of moral questions that have to be asked, and it's not black and white. There's a lot of different issues to discuss with this. So too, but when it comes to Sharia, if someone is going to do an honor killing, and they say that's what their religion calls for, you can't do that in America. You're just not allowed to do it. If now, however, there are other questions. Obviously, there need to be Sharia courts to, of laws of marriage and divorce, just like we need halachic batei din, Jewish courts of marriage and divorce and conversions and to help people with, financial disputes, which the Sharia courts do as well. A question would be, what if, the Sharia court would say, if you, you committed this crime and we have to chop off your hand. I don't know if they actually do that, but, that's the stereotype. And maybe they do that in other countries. I think in other countries they do that. What if in America, my feeling would be, even though I think it's wrong, and I'm opposed to that, I think if you have someone who's a penitent and is willing to have his hand chopped off as a punishment for a crime that he committed, I could see that he could have the right to allow the court to chop his hand off if he's willing to do so, but he shouldn't be forced to do so against his will. All of this being said, but obviously if they want to impose Sharia law on Christians and Jews and atheists, or on Muslims who don't want to live up to Islam and don't have the free choice to do so, you can't do that in America, because religious freedom works both ways. Obviously the cases that we spoke of in, recalcitrant husbands refusing to divorce their wives who are being beaten, obviously they don't want to be beaten. Although Maimonides, says that you beat him until he says, I want to. And there's a whole theology behind that really deep in his heart, he wants to do what's right, religiously speaking. And so it's not because, the husband has to willingly divorce his wife. He can't be forced to divorce his wife. And there's a whole issue with that. And is the divorce even valid? And if such a divorce is made, so then if the wife remarries, is she committing adultery? And there's all kinds of different questions and issues that we can discuss as far as these questions are concerned. And many other questions as far as marriage laws in Judaism, which are very complicated, particularly divorce. Marriage is not that complicated, but divorce is. Marriage, as long as you're allowed to get married, that's a different story. And divorce is very complicated in Jewish law, but sometimes it's seen as the right thing to do, and there are many communities that will, most Orthodox communities will put other pressures on a man who refuses to divorce his wife. So he's not going to physically attack. He's not that most Orthodox communities will not physically violently attack a man, but they might, stage peaceful protests in front of his place of work. If it's an extreme case, in front of his place of business. In less extreme cases, they'll tell people not to do business with such men, not to allow them in the synagogue, not to give them any honors in the synagogue, different things like that. And obviously, if he's not religious, he's not going to care about, being denied entrance to synagogue, And even if he is somewhat religious, he's like, all right, so I pray at home, so I have to pray in the synagogue, And there are different stories like this. I know this is off the subject, but it's related to the question. Because all of this being said, I'm not the worry is of theocratic Muslims trying to take over America, and I don't really think that's going to happen on the national scale unless it's in an act of war. But I don't think it can. I don't think it's something that's possible to happen peacefully. Through numbers, because the numbers are not going to ever be that big. And for the most part, most of the Muslims who live in America are not theocrats. Most Muslims who live in America just want to live their life, have their religious freedom. Maybe the more extreme ones might want to impose their religion among their fellow Muslims, and maybe they might think of using violent means if a member of their community is misbehaving. And there has to be knowledge that you can't get away with that in America. Jewish people can't get away with it. Mormons can't get away with it. To the extent